Welcome everybody. This is the first in what is kind of a new series for the graduate school. Last year we did a one-day graduate research skills seminar where we packed a bunch of research-related topics into the same day. And that was pretty successful, although a common piece of feedback was, Glenn, that means if I can't come on this day, I miss all of them. So this time we decided to distribute them and sprinkle them throughout the spring semester. 3 of them are scheduled. This is the first, and I'll just give you the quick preview of coming attractions here. There are going to be 2 of these installments in this research skills series next week. Finding and applying for external funding is Thursday, 12:30 to 1:45, right upstairs, HL 207. And then on Friday, understanding the IRB process with the ORIP folks is going to be in this room, 2:30 to 3:45. Yeah, writing for publication. It's something you got to do, especially if you're looking down the road to making applications for faculty jobs. You're going to need something publication related on your CV to be a competitive candidate coming out of Syracuse University. Obviously you do a lot of scholarly writing for your classes. You have to produce papers and other projects with write-ups. So how do you take that and turn it into something that you can then shop around to journals as an official publication? That's what we're talking about here today. Professor Laura Vanderdrift from the psychology department has done versions of this a bunch of times. I keep hearing about how great they are. So when I decided to do the lineup in this format, she was one of my first calls and graciously accepted. Since she is in psychology, and as I understand it, most of the previous iterations of her talk have been pitched primarily for a STEM or scientific audience, graduate student audience, there will be kind of that flavor to it. We talked about trying to speak in generalities to the extent possible. But if you are, let's say, in a humanistic field, I want to draw your attention to another program that is coming up Monday the 27th, is turning conference papers into published articles from a religion professor, Virginia Burris. So that will cover a lot of the same ground, but presumably even more directly relevant to those of you in the humanities. Okay, so with that, I won't take up any more of Professor Burris's time.
All right. Thanks for having me. Thanks for coming. I know it's like grind time in the semester, and it's a Friday afternoon, so we'll try and make this fun. Just so I have a sense, because I know some of you, but not all of you, can just by a show of hands, as if we're like undergrads, I get this is annoying, but just so I know, the STEM field people here, including psychology, and then the humanities, and then is there anybody I didn't cover? Okay, I don't know what else there is.
Linguistics.
Linguistics, okay.
Lives somewhere between us.
Right, yeah, there's quite a few on the cusp, okay. I appreciate you all coming, like I said. So I'm going to try and talk generally about the writing process more than specifically about, in psychology, the introduction section should do this, because I think that is something better handled perhaps in-house in your disciplines. Instead, we'll talk about what might be relevant across fields, about the struggles we have when we sit down to write and get those ideas that we have onto paper and make them distinguishable by other people. I think that's what we're going to focus on some today. I've kind of left this somewhat, like I have things we'll talk about, but if there's any point where we want to diverge, or you have questions, or you have thoughts that you want to go in a different direction slightly, I'm more than welcome those. So please make this as interactive as you would like. Before we get started, is there anything that anyone's like, I'm here for this reason, and if this doesn't happen, I'm going to be furious? Okay, then that's good. If I didn't get you a handout before this started, grab one from me at the end. You don't need them to go through. They're not even in order of what we're going through here, but it's just like a summary of everything that hopefully I'll talk about today so that you don't have to like worry about scribbling notes madly. So grab one of those for me before you leave if you want. Okay. So the most general advice, the biggest picture, like taking a step back and setting the stage for my perspective on scientific writing, would be to remind you that writing is a learned skill. It requires practice, and it requires getting feedback that you calibrate to. I want to emphasize this because I think there's this lay notion, especially among, well, I don't know, especially among, I see it a lot when I work with students in psychology, so that's who I'll speak to, but I see this like perception that like, oh, I'm not a good writer, or I'm just waiting for inspiration to strike and then it's all going to come, or I'm waiting for this great moment of like clarity in my thoughts and then I'll sit down and write the paper. And when that doesn't come, it can feel very frustrating and deadlines come and go. And what ends up happening, I think for a lot, perhaps you can relate to this, is like you have an idea, you can't quite articulate it, you sit down to write, it's not exactly accessible to you, it's kind of like a balloon floating away and you're about to grab the string but it's not quite there. And then a deadline for a conference or for a grant submission or that your advisor imposed on you or something shows up and you panically write something and then learn, oh, I'm really good with deadlines. I just need the pressure to write and then I can like produce all this brilliance then. And it's aversive, and then when you start thinking about writing in the future, you're thinking, oh, this is a terrible thing that happens and I don't like this experience. Is that accurate for anyone? Right, okay. So I think if I can do nothing else today but to dispel the notion that that's the only way to do it, I will be successful. I think perhaps more accurate than thinking of writing as a skill, we can call it an exercise. If you were to have a goal of running a half marathon this spring, you might read some books on how to do it. You might, talk to people about how to do it. You might think a lot about doing it, but eventually you just got to go out and start running. If you don't put in the hours running, by the time that big marathon, half marathon comes up, you're not going to be prepared. Let's see. I think the requiring practice and requiring feedback, the feedback component especially is what I see people shying away from, myself included, for sure. It seems like we're supposed to be good at writing. Like part of being a good scientist is being good at writing your ideas down. And it's somewhat embarrassing to know that like you have an idea that's pretty good, but then what you've written is garbage. And you're supposed to give that garbage to someone else and say, how can we turn this into not garbage? I think there's some like stigma associated with that. But without getting that feedback and without hearing somebody else say like, well, here's what's going on with this sentence that's making it not work, or here's the part that's unclear, you're never going to know how to make that better. So I think actually getting the feedback is important. And then being sensitive to the feedback is important, of course. So if you keep hearing the same things over and over again, then you'll know what to edit yourself for in the future, and you won't need as much feedback from others. I also think writing is a really important tool, not just for communicating the ideas you already have and telling other people what you're about and what your work is about, but I think it's a skill you can use to get your ideas to be more clear in and of themselves. So I think part of when I was struggling more with the idea of writing being this big, scary task that I would put off until absolutely necessary, part of that for me was this myth that I had bought into that I need to have the idea formalized in my mind before I could sit down to write it down. So the myth is I write down what my idea is. The reality that I've noticed in myself, and that I think I hear from people that I think of as successful writers, or prolific writers at least, what they tell me is you get ideas when you write. So many people go to writing and start writing their ideas down, and that's when they realize, oh, here's a flaw in my logic, or here's how this is going to flow into this other part. And so just continually writing, whether for publication or for your own clarity, is a good technique to kind of both get better at writing and formalize your ideas. I went and saw David Sedaris present at the On Center a couple years ago now, I guess, but he's, like, if you've never seen him, it's fun to go, like, he just does readings of his books, and he's very personable, and what I was most impressed by is he sits outside afterwards to sign books, and he will stay there until literally everybody who wants to meet him meets him, and it takes forever. He like has meals delivered while he's sitting there because he'll have full conversations with you if you want. Like you'll walk up to him and like whatever you want to talk about, he'll just talk for a while and he'll make small talk with everybody. But when I got up in the front of the line, I said, you write so much. Where do you get your ideas for what to write? Not even thinking in the context of like, I need ideas for writing, I'm going to ask this writer. It was just sort of like how I was making small talk with him. He said, oh, I get ideas for what to write about by writing. So he just constantly writes, and ideas come out of there, and he picks moments out of what he's writing and turns those into the formal written pieces you see. And I think as scientists and humanists, is that the word I would use if I were doing that? Okay. We can use that same technique. We could use writing as our kind of formal thinking to come up with ideas. So with that in mind, I'm going to propose some potential stages of writing that if you find yourself stuck often might help you break through that. First is the planning stage. And this is, I think, perhaps the stage that we skip through sometimes in our haste to have a product. Like I need to write a paper, so I sit down to write a paper, rather than sit down to write my plan for my paper. In this stage, I think you can get your ideas down, and don't worry about what they sound like. This is for your eyes only. This isn't I'm writing something to express to somebody else what I'm thinking. This is to get the ideas out of your head onto a piece of paper. So just in whatever form you want, start writing. I'll say on my hard drive, I think I have probably 200 weirdly agrammatical, 2-page, continuous thoughts where I need to write this paper, I don't know what it's about yet, I kind of have a sense of it, I know what my hypotheses are, I just don't know how I'm building there. So I just start writing. 2 pages later, something's more clear, and I'm able to pick out what I need from that, and I just keep that, but it's useless to me at that point, right? It's just that it served its purpose. After that, you can prepare a document that outlines the paper. So once you have the idea formalized, perhaps through writing, then, and I'll tell you why I think this is important. I used to find outlines to be quite labor-intensive and very low payoff activities. Perhaps you're not that person. But for me, it was like, why am I going to outline this paper like I know it is? I think I got hung up in the well, at first you start with a Roman numeral, and then you go to the big letter, and then you go to the number, and then it got too formulaic, and I didn't know, I got hung up on the format. But now I make outlines of a very particular kind that I'll share with you because I think they help me keep the paper moving even when my inspiration wanes on that particular paper. In fact, do I want to think about those right now? Or is that coming up next? I think I'll tell you about that a little bit now. There's probably more detail on this later. But in this paper, this outline, what I do is I sort of just identify the paragraphs I need for each section. So in my papers, there's the introduction, method, result, discussion. I think of the introduction as perhaps the first barrier to entry with the paper. I'll argue later that perhaps you should start with a method section or something that you can just knock out without thinking too much, because then you get some momentum going. You're like, wow, I already have 6 pages of a paper. I'm doing great. We'll get to that. But if you're thinking about the introduction, I think instead of thinking this is necessary this and this is necessary this, think what arguments do I need to make? How many paragraphs do I need for each argument? And list those out. So my introductions typically end up being about 5 paragraphs. The first one is an overview paragraph. The last one is my here's what I'm about to tell you, what studies I'm about to run paragraph. And then there's 3 to 6 or something in the middle that lay out the steps of the arguments. So identify what the steps I need to lay out are, and then I describe what type of paragraph I'm writing. I'll tell you more about that in a second. The reason I think this is so useful is I don't have solid chunks of free time in my life to sit down and remember every part of my introduction at a time. I seem to have half-hour to hour chunks free, where I sit in my office and think, oh, I should work on that paper. Oh, I only have half an hour. If I have this outline as detailed as I can make them, then I can say, well, in half an hour, I can definitely write 1 paragraph on this one concept that I need for this paper. And I can just pull that paragraph out. I don't have to think, what's the whole argument I'm building in this whole introduction? I just think, oh, I needed a paragraph on this. I'll write that right now. And it becomes much more manageable to chunk it up that way for me. So we'll keep building more details onto this for you. After I make my outline, if I can, if I haven't backed myself up to some immovable deadline, which seems to happen more than I would care to admit, even knowing that this is a bad idea. If I have the time, usually I'll put that outline away, put the page of gibberish that I've written away, and maybe give it up to 2 weeks of just it's out of my head now. So that when I pick it back up, I've forgotten all the logic that brought me from point A to point B, and I have to now take it on its merit and say, do these 2 points actually connect? Or did they seem like they connected in the moment? If they seem like they no longer, if I'm like, I still can't figure out how these two are connected, then I know I need another paragraph, or I need to do something different in my introduction. I think sometimes when we go straight from planning to writing, all those like leaps in logic you were making are still in your mind, and they don't look like leaps to you because they make sense to you in the moment. But if you take a step back, forget what those leaps were, come back to it, they might be more obvious for you. And then I start writing. So everything I've done to this point, all of which, except percolating, all of which is sort of written, is not considered writing. I put all that, that's all in a new, I open a blank Word document and start there. I don't try and turn that 2-page thing of gibberish I wrote into my paper. I don't try and turn my outline itself into my paper. I start with all of that as my preparation that's in my head. I like to prime good models before I start, so especially if I intend to spend a big chunk of time writing, or I'm putting the big kind of arc on the tone of my paper, I like to prime good models. So probably you've come across a paper that just felt like a joy to read to you, like it's in your field, perhaps you know the author, but like the voice throughout it just speaks to you. It might be different than everyone else in your field. Maybe the content doesn't even make that much sense to you, but something about the way the author uses the language appeals to you. I have one paper that I keep going back to. Every time I start to write a new paper, I'll read this particular introduction, because the way he uses words and the way he builds an argument really resonates with me. And so I'll read his paper, get that voice in my head, and then begin writing if I have the opportunity to, if I have that much time, and the tone really matters a lot to me. So that I remember, that sounds good to me, let's start there. I also order the tasks so that I can start simple. Like I said, I like to get a running start at this. For me, in my field, what this means is I start by writing my methods section. Usually this can be done while the study is still ongoing. It's like, what measures did you collect? What did you do to the participants? All that kind of good stuff. In your field, it might be a different part. Perhaps you don't have that really easy rote, I just got to give you the details of what measures we use part, in which case you obviously need to start with this. But if you have something where you're like, I know I'm going to have to describe this, it's mindless, it's just factual, start with that. Start with the easiest thing for you to start with. For me, it's methods. I then make my tables, then I write my results section. And all of this, for me, doesn't require oh, did I phrase that the way I want to? Is this argument being built correctly? For me, all of these are just factual. So it's really easy to kind of start with those without having to make a lot of choices. Once I have those then, I look at my paper and I have a title page, I have the page the abstract goes on, I have all these tables, I have a method and results. That's almost a full paper. Now I have so much momentum, I'm excited, I can see the end, I'm ready to tackle what for me are the harder parts of introduction, discussion, and then finally abstract. Those are in order of how challenging I find them. So for you, in your field, in your own struggles with writing, maybe methods are the thing that are impossible for you to write. Put that at the end. But whatever is hardest at the end, because by then you're so invested, you're going to get through it. Just because if that's the only thing keeping you away from a publication, you're going to pop through, right? And then the most important step by far is editing. We'll talk about what I edit for specifically. There's a list of things I go through with every paper. You have my list. Or if you don't, I have them for you at the end. But there are things that every time I finish a paper, before anyone reads it, I go through and change all these things. I don't try and change them when I'm writing. Writing is hard enough as it is, without trying to make it sound good too. Do that later. Just get the idea out, and then go back and make sure everything is as you want it to be in the edit stage. That's a bad habit to break, perhaps, for some of you. For me, it definitely was, because you get to here, you have a full paper at this point. That's exciting. You could just send that somewhere and never think about it again. And usually by the end, that's what I'm ready to do with the paper. Perhaps it's a cynical view of it, but usually there's a burnout period where I'm I've been doing nothing but working on this paper for weeks. I'm ready to be off my desk. But I think it's important to give it that final edit, or a couple edits, as it might be. So, any questions or comments about the stages of writing so far? Well, I have some tips for increasing volume for you. These are I don't know, I went through a phase of reading a lot of books about writing. I teach a professional development class for our first year grad students in the social psych area, and a big, like 6 weeks of it is on writing, and so to prepare for that I read almost every book a social scientist has ever written about how to write, which is sort of a waste of time. I don't really recommend. Like 1 or 2 works, and then you should just use that time to write, is the take-home message I would give you after a summer of doing nothing but reading writing books. But here's like the tips that stood out to me, and for either me or people I've worked with have been the most useful. You might already have a system. You might not have a problem with volume. You might pump out as much text as you want, and your problem is something different. If your problem is not being able to get the word count you want, not being able to get as much volume in writing as you want, I highly recommend regularity. Everything we learn to do well is something that we do regularly. Again, back to my running example, which isn't a great example because cardiovascular endurance works a little different than ability at writing, but go with it. You get better at it by being consistent. You do it day in and day out with a plan, and that plan is how you get better at it. With anything, right? Practice is the key to success. And so with writing, I think the same thing holds true, but we often don't want to admit that. What I recommend is shooting for a particular word count or page count or amount of time you spend writing. If you can swing it every day, I have yet to meet somebody who can't swing that. I personally could when I was in grad school towards the end, when I was on fellowship and no longer teaching and had a job. But so for that 1 month, that was great. But other than that, I've never had like every day available to me for writing. But I set a schedule and I stick to my schedule, and I think that's very helpful. So I know this semester it's Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday mornings. I spend some time writing. Not a huge chunk usually. Somewhere between 1 to 4 hours in the morning, I spend writing. I used to use a time metric. Everyone's different, so you have to know yourself and experiment with different methods and figure out what works for you. I started with a time metric of I'm going to write for 2 hours a day, here's the 2 hours I'm going to write. That turned into me having a hard time staying with the writing task. It turned out that was a good time also to clean my kitchen or check my email or do something else because I just had to kill 2 hours and then my job was done for the day. So I switched to a word count per day goal, and my word count changes based on how much time I have available. And I like this better because then I feel like once I've achieved it, then I get free time. And so it keeps me more focused. Like if I'm cleaning my kitchen, then I'm cutting into my potential free time. But you've lived in your own heads for longer than I have, right? So you'll know how to motivate yourself better than I would be able to give you advice. But think about perhaps the implications of all these different strategies. And aim for something tangible when you sit down. Instead of just like, oh, it's writing time, I'm going to write a paper, which is daunting as all get out. Think, I'm going to, just 500 words. That's not, you could do that right now, right? Like if I said, let's write 500 words about your research, you could absolutely do it. And it's less intimidating, I think, than writing a paper. I would say give yourself this time. I think because we've all had that experience, or most of us, it seemed like we're nodding with me, that experience of I've backed myself up to a deadline, now I have to pull an all-nighter and write this paper and submit it, and then probably it was okay, like if it was a conference deadline, probably it was accepted. If it was a grant deadline, you probably were convinced it wasn't going to get funded anyway, so. And this gives us this reinforcement that this is a good strategy. I think we do things better when we do them consistently, not under pressure. The literature is very clear. When we're under enormous pressure, our non-dominant responses become harder for us. If I were to ask you to do something you're not very good at, under an immense amount of pressure, you're going to do it worse than if I took all that pressure off and said, just go ahead and try it. So don't put yourself in that position with writing if you can avoid it. I think something in one of the books I was reading said, if you respect the idea you have enough, this should be a no-brainer, right? If you think that in a hurried overnight writing session the night before a deadline, you were able to get this idea out there, then it wasn't probably that good of an idea, right? If you respect it, you think this is important and you're contributing in some way, giving it the time that it deserves to make the best impact it could is worth it. I recommend not waiting until you have a completely free and clear day to write a paper, primarily because I have not found one of those yet. Maybe your lives are different. But those don't seem to show up just a ton for me, where I'm like, oh good, nothing at all on my calendar all day, and the inspiration to write has struck, and I'm not distracted today, so I'll write the entire paper today. For me, that doesn't work. Perhaps for you it will, but I recommend if you're struggling, try being more regular rather than doing that. I think it also creates too much pressure. If it's not happening, if something's going wrong, if you're feeling kind of distracted, if something comes up and the research assistant didn't show up and you need to go cover, all of this then feels worse than it needs to, because this was your only day to write your paper, and now this annoyance is in your way, and it kind of can create some catastrophe. It's just also not how we learn to do difficult things, as I already said. I also recommend don't try to plan and write the actual paper at the same time. If you're sitting down with a paper that has a title page and looks like the thing you're going to submit somewhere, you should already know what it's going to say. The planning stage should happen before you get to that moment, ideally, where you know the intro is going to be this many paragraphs, it's going to lead to this point, here are the major studies I need to make sure I cite, or here are the major themes I need to make sure I hit. You should know all that before you start writing your actual paper. And in the same vein, don't try and edit and write at the same time. Like I said, writing is hard. It's not, things don't come out perfectly the first time. And if you're censoring yourself, and if you're, while you're typing, thinking, oh wait, that's not, now this part, like this is, the subject changed halfway through my sentence, that's a disaster. Or, oh wait, I meant to, like, I don't want to use this word anymore, or I can't remember what the right word to use here is. It's going to slow you down. You're going to lose the track of what you're actually thinking about, the actual big picture of what the sentence should say, and get bogged down in how it's being said. I think when you're writing, just write and know that no one but you will read that, and you'll be able to fix the fact that you changed sentences or subjects halfway through your sentence at a later point. And then actually go back and edit to fix all that later. I also think it can be really useful to form a writing group or have a writing buddy. I know the psych faculty have a writing group that meets weekly. Some of them. It's very exclusive, so don't tell people. But it can be helpful to have a time set aside with a group of people. They can be various purposes. So some writing groups I've heard of get together and talk about what they're writing. I find this to be frustrating for me because I think, well, I could be using this time writing if I weren't telling you what I should be writing. But maybe that's helpful when you're getting used to like tips and strategies and how you'll go about writing. For me, my writing group is very like, we all show up, we sit in a room, we'll do like a head nod at each other, and we're just like headphones in looking at our paper. Every now and then someone goes up and reappears with coffee, but like we're not interacting, we're not doing much with each other. We're just there for like social support, some accountability, like I know everyone else is going to show up and write, so I got to show up and write, and you feel a little weird like checking your email when everyone else is writing, so you write better. I bullied, I think, some of our graduate students into doing that too, so I really recommend it within your area if you can. If you're getting a little bit more desperation, some of these books got a little ridiculous. One was like, just don't stop typing. Leave your hands on your keyboard and keep them moving. If you run out of things to type, just start typing like, I don't know what I'm doing next, and then like eventually you'll get back on track. Maybe that'll work for you. It doesn't for me, I've tried. But the biggest one is don't censor yourself. So I've edited this here, but what this is getting at is I believe it's Ernest Hemingway, whose strategy for writing is write drunk, edit sober. I wouldn't say to do that all the time, you need a functioning liver, but I think the message behind that is good, and I think this is something we can remember, is if that's a good strategy, if that works, and it did for him, and I think if you talk to faculty and you say that, I think a lot of them will be like, oh, I think why that works is it turns that little sensor off. That little part of your brain is like, no, that sounds stupid, or no, you used the word subject and you should use participant, or no, you said like, you know, all of that kind of like little nitpicky stuff where you're like editing while you're writing goes away if you're just like, I'm the best at this. I'm just going to write a bunch and this is fun, and you're kind of in that like more up stage that sometimes writing drunk could give you. So if you channel that mindset, however you find it in your life makes sense, then that could be more advantageous for you. They're like, I'm just writing and it's going to be great. And then go back later with your like critical lens on to fix it. If I told you right now, like, we're going to collaborate, any one of you, We're going to collaborate on a paper. I'll either write it all and you can edit it, or you can write it all and I'll edit it. Which would you pick? You'd want me to write it all, right? And then you'd edit it, because editing is probably easier. So don't make writing harder by editing at the same time. That's the big message. So before I was talking about how when I make my outlines, I say I need 4 paragraphs and they need to be this kind of paragraph. Here's what I mean by that. I don't know why this was like life-changing for me when I read this in one of those writing books, but it was. Paragraphs have this structure. If you're in a humanity field and this is like your life, I apologize for dumbing this down so much. Don't judge me. So they have a topic sentence, which tells you, hey, this paragraph is about this. Then they have supporting statements. And there are 3 types of supporting statement groupings. These supporting statements can either expand by detail, by comparison, or by process. So it can either be like, here's a paragraph about bees. Bees are yellow, bees are black, bees have stingers. That would be expanding by detail. I'm telling you more about bees as the paragraph goes on. I can expand by comparison. I could say, bees and butterflies are different. Bees do this, whereas butterflies do this, and then butterflies do this, but bees don't. So I'm comparing 2 things. Or I can expand by process. So I can say, bees pollinate flowers by flying about. They go to one flower and get some. I didn't plan this example in advance. I don't know why we're in the world of bees instead of my actual research, but we are. So bees like go to a flower, I assume, and like take something from it, and then go to a different flower and leave that somewhere else. Now I've expanded by process. That's it. There's no other kind of paragraph that can exist that makes sense in a scientific article. So if you're thinking, in this paragraph I need to describe what bees are, then you're expanding by detail. So what you can write in your outline when you're planning your paper is like, first I need to tell people what bees are. So you can write like, what are bees, ? Expand by detail. Then if you have a free 20 minutes, you're like, oh, I can write a 200-word paragraph about what bees are, expanding by detail, and then all you gotta do is describe what bees are and put it back. Maybe you'll say, oh, here I have to describe how this process turned this molecule into this other compound or something. And you have an expand by process paragraph. You say, how does this lead to this? Expand by process. You know exactly what you're writing without needing to go back through and remember your entire introduction structure each time you sit down to write. And then there's a concluding sentence that wraps it all up. One other tip here is writing flows better when all paragraphs are roughly the same length. In all my papers, they all have a slightly different length for some reason. I've not yet figured out what the variable is here that makes some papers have really long paragraphs and other papers have really short paragraphs, but there's something. What I tend to do is write a paragraph, figure out how long it is, and then make the rest of them kind of match that. If you're reading a paper and all the paragraphs are like a page long, and then there's this little like 4-line short little paragraph, that paragraph's going to feel really underdeveloped, even if the idea is complete. It's going to seem like that didn't have as much detail as the rest of the paragraphs, and so something's missing there. Likewise, if all the paragraphs are like 4 lines, and then you have this whopper of a page long paragraph, that one's going to seem like long and cumbersome and not make a lot of sense. So you want them all to be roughly the same length for flow, and so everything seems equally fleshed out and clear. So once you figure out how long your average paragraph is, or your paragraphs in this paper will be, the process of writing can become a lot easier. If you have an outline, you know, oh, I'm writing 300-word paragraphs for some reason in this paper. Here I need one on this construct by detail. I have half an hour free. I can write 300 words about that. Let me show you an example now. We're kind of getting into what I do when I edit, because this is sort of how I plan to write. And now we'll talk about how we edit, but I have some examples of actual papers. These are all from Psych Science, which is a kind of a top-tier psych journal, but it's a very short-form journal. So the writing is very, very tight and concise, but not necessarily good always. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. So this first one is an example of what I think is not great. So I'll read it to you, and then we'll talk about why it's not great as potential, like, first thing you can do to edit. So it says the power to create and communicate a new message to fit a new experience is not a competence animals have in their natural states. Their genetic code limits the number of and kinds of messages that they can communicate. Information about distance, direction, and richness of pollen and flowers is the only information that can be communicated by bees, for example. A limited repertoire of messages delivered in the same way for generation after generation is characteristic of animals of the same species in all significant respects. So clearly I primed myself with bees, is why we were talking about bees earlier, but I forgot this example was coming. So that's a pretty standard, like, academic paragraph where you'd have to be in this field to understand what this is saying, but you can kind of get the gist that, like, we're not really, like, great at expressing information to others, maybe. Here's a rewrite I did just really quickly of this paragraph, fixing just one problem it has. In their natural states, most animals lack the power to create and communicate a new message to fit a new experience. Their genetic code enables them to communicate only a limited number and kind of messages. Bees, for example, can communicate only about the distance, direction, or richness of pollen and flowers. In all significant respects, animals of the same species are able to communicate a limited repertoire of messages delivered in the same way for generation after generation. Is this clearer than the first one? So the only thing I changed was what the subjects of the sentences were. In our first example, I've highlighted what the subjects are here in orange. I apologize if the colors aren't coming through, but we have the power to create and communicate, their genetic code, information, and a limited repertoire of messages were the subjects of that first example I showed you that to me reads pretty clunky and hard to understand. In the one that I edited, I changed it so the subject of each sentence was consistent across the paragraph. So now our subjects are animals, their genetic code, meaning animals' genetic code, bees, and animals. So by changing the subject to be relatively consistent, not exact synonyms, but at least an animal. I'm not sure if bees are animals. Again, we're not in my wheelhouse with this bee example that I've gone with. But by changing the subject from all over the place, some of it is like messages, other parts are animals, to now we're just talking about these animals, the paragraph becomes a little bit easier to understand. When I write, this is what I start with, always. My sentence is always all over, or my subject is always all over the place. And the first thing I do when editing is look at each paragraph I have and think, okay, what is the subject of this paragraph? That then should be the subject of my sentences within this paragraph. If what I care about is animals, then that's got to be the subject of my sentences here. Change it there. This is also a tip to help combat writer's block in some way. So if you're halfway through a paragraph and you're stuck, and you're like, I don't know what comes next, but I know what I need to get to, but I don't know how to get there. This piece on cohesion can help with that. So writing is cohesive when information from one sentence appears in the first few words of the next sentence. I have a couple more examples to show you this. In successful conversations, partners jointly establish names for the objects, places, and things they talk about. A clear communicative advantage is obtained when partners share the names in common. So we've changed subjects. First we're talking about our partners, or the names, but then we've changed to talking about this advantage in the subject of the second one. A more cohesive way to write this would say, in successful conversations, partners jointly establish names, blah, blah, blah. These names confer a clear communicative advantage, but only in this case. So if you've gotten to the end of the first sentence, now you're writing. You write this first sentence, you're like, oh, I don't know where I'm going next. Well, the thing it has to go to is names. We just brought up these names for objects, places, things they talk about. That's what you have to talk about next, is the names, to keep yourself going, right? Because it's cohesive when the end of one sentence is familiar in the beginning of the next sentence. If you flip this sentence, it sounds uncomfortable because the beginning of this sentence is not the familiar part. Communicative advantage is what's new about this sentence. The names are what's familiar about it from the sentence before. So as a reader, this sounds better. As a writer, you can use that. So if you're stuck, what did I just talk about? I just talked about the names for the objects. Why am I talking about the names of the objects? Oh, because the names provide the advantage. That's why I'm talking about them. So you know how every time you finish a sentence, you know what the next sentence should start with. It should start with whatever you just ended your previous sentence with. If that doesn't make any sense whatsoever, it's like, why would I talk about that? Then the sentence you just wrote is a dead end and not in line with what your goal for that paragraph is, and that sentence should be edited there. Sometimes I think we get those sprawling paragraphs with a bunch of sentences in the middle that don't make sense, because we're trying to get from A to B, but A was like written wrong, and it ended with the wrong piece of information, and you didn't get to B, except through multiple other steps that were unnecessary. So this gets us to talking about the importance of editing. First and foremost is knowing yourself. I have a literal sheet. You don't have this one, it's very idiosyncratic, but the things I know I do about my writing. I am excellent at using the word thus too many times in a paragraph. So I have a piece of paper that just says thus on it. I get out the piece of paper when I'm done writing a paper. I think, oh, that's right, I always do that. So I hit like Command F, find every instance of thus, and remove all but like less than 100 of them or something, right? There's some of these are like, you'll figure them out as you write. You'll find that every time I turn something in, my advisor changes while to whereas. Clearly this is a problem I have. So you'll just write while to whereas on a piece of paper. When you go to edit, you'll know that's something you're going to have to change in your own writing. Instead of trying to change it while you're writing, which is making the harder part of it harder, do it after. Know that being concise is good. We have a bad habit in our field of using sentence sprawl. I think that might be across fields, I would guess. These are both one sentence each. It's the same information. I don't know why I didn't use animation here. But it's not great. It's not great. But one is much easier to understand. So the first is, given the knowledge that males have historically been the primary agents of intergroup aggression in humans, and that the potential for harm present in the stimulus prepares the fear system for functionally specialized behavioral outcomes, such as fight, flight, or freeze, we predicted that the fear extinction bias between in-group and out-group found by Olson et al. Would occur solely when the exemplars are male. Like, that sucks, first of all. That's not a good sentence. But part of why it's not good, like, I can get, this is still one sentence, but it's an edit that I think makes it better. So I said, we predicted that the fear extinction bias between in-group and out-group, Olson et al., would occur solely when the exemplars are male, because males have been the primary agents of intergroup aggression, humans, and the potential blah, 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 blah. I think it's easier to understand in the second one, and I think if you're reading a paper and you read this, you're going to have to go back to the beginning and start over when you get to the end of it to figure it out. Whereas this one, I think maybe you can get to the end of and keep moving. And I think it's a very simple edit. That edit is where the subject is. Here we have this whole clause, given the knowledge that all of this stuff happens, like the subject of this sentence is the fear extinction bias. And you learn about it for the first time here. Whereas this one is here. So I know this is a sentence about the fear extinction bias, and I know why you're telling me about that. Up here, you're giving me all this information about men, and I don't know why. And now I know why at the very end. So if you give the important stuff up front and then tackle the details on it at the end, it's a little bit easier to read. So when we have problems with sentence sprawl, when we have those sentences that are really, really long, and you get to the end and you're like, okay, let's go back and figure out if we can get this the second time around. Probably you didn't get to the subject too quickly. Maybe you interrupted the subject-verb connection, so there's too much going on between the subject and verb. This happens a lot when you say, like, males, because of histories of having all these problems with fight or flight or freeze and blah, 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 have a fear extinction bias. Like, if you did that, then I still don't know what you're talking about until I get through all of that. So I want, males have a stronger fear extinction bias because of everything else. You want your subject and verb connected. You don't want to interrupt the verb-object connection if relevant, and you don't want to end sentences with a string of clauses or a weak clause. So that's where the last example still didn't do great. But perhaps you need one or two of those on your paper. One or two long sentences is not going to bog a reader down too much. It will make that sentence stand out and seem really important. So you want to think about whether you want that to happen or if it's better to cut that into two. Another of the common things I edit for that I think we all probably could edit for, besides just these things so far, is academies. Sort of like legalese or bureaucraties. whatever. Academies is like if you picked up a paper and everything's like, perhaps it sounds like this. The cause of our educational system's failure at teaching basic skills to children is not understanding the influence of their cultural background on learning. Sounds kind of like an academic way of saying something compared to our educational system has failed to teach children the basic skills because we do not understand their cultural background. The first sounds more like, I don't know why, I do know why. I think to our ears it's like sounds more scientific or it sounds more technical or something, when really it's just harder to read. Academies happens when we don't follow these rules. The subject of the sentence should be the main character, and the verb of your sentence should be the important action. Here's an example. I'll show you what I mean. Independence is gained by those on welfare when skills are taught that the marketplace values. Our subject is independence, right? Which is not who's acting in this sentence. Who's acting are those on welfare. But independence is the noun we're going with, is the subject we're going with here because of the way the sentence is constructed. And the verb is, which is not very actiony. It's not the most important thing that's happening in the subject. Instead, you've buried a fun action in gain, maybe? You could say individuals on welfare gain independence when they learn skills that are valuable in the marketplace. It becomes much more pleasant to read and a little bit less like heavy. It's less challenging. Individuals on welfare become independent when they learn valuable skills. So you could go one step farther if you want. All of these are pointing at nominalizations, which is a noun derived from a verb or an adjective. So if you have a verb, I have more examples. I can't think of them on the top of my head. It's Friday afternoon. You'll forgive me. Yeah.
Would you say a lot of these examples are getting at active versus passive voice?
Some of it, that's part of why we use nominalizations, for sure. And I don't think that's necessarily a problem. Sometimes you don't need to know who did the action, so using passive voice is okay. But sometimes it's just bad writing. And I think we use it unintentionally instead of just like, well, you don't really need to know who did this, so I'm going to use passive voice. Sometimes it's just like, I think it sounds smarter to say the cause of the failure instead of we failed. Like I think sometimes it just sounds fancier or something, even though it makes it harder to read. These are going to end with schon, meant, ents. A verb example would be the expectation is that participants in the two groups, instead we could say like we expect. So instead of expect, which is kind of a cool verb that has like some action to it, you can picture somebody expecting something. Instead of that being your verb, you have is as your verb, which tells you nothing. So you're kind of hiding your cool action in a really lame word. An adjective example here is the two groups show no difference in mean IQ scores. That's a super common thing in my field, at least, to say like the groups did not differ on this. Why not the groups did not differ in this? Again, Friday afternoon. So instead of showed no difference, they didn't differ. Why not? Why not do that? Why do you need the showed part? So to edit this out of your writing if you don't like it, underline the first 7 to 8 words of a sentence. Ask about those. Do they focus on abstract nouns rather than the actual characters? Does it take a really long time to get to your verb, to get to the actual action of your sentence? Are the verbs less specific than the action that's buried in the nouns? And then analyze who are the main characters and what are their actions. With every single sentence you write, it's time intensive at first. You get used to it, for sure. And then your writing becomes much more active and engaging. Like you get sucked more in when you write not in academics. Because I'm not hearing about your expectations and thinking your expectations are, I'm like in there with you expecting the same. And then rewrite it to fix all of that. I have examples, I believe. The intention of the committee is to select a new president. Super common way of writing. Instead, you could say that the character should be the committee. The action should be intend. So you could say the committee intends to select a new president. Instead, the intention of the committee is. It cuts down on your word count. It makes it more just splashy in some way. Try this one. It does appear that biological cues exert more consistent influence on racial categorizations than do cultural cues. What's our character? Yeah, biological cues are our character. And our action? Influence. So where did the quotes go? Influence. So right now, our subject is kind of it, and then, I'm not really sure. But you could write it, biological cues influence racial categorizations more than cultural cues do. If that makes sense. Yeah.
There's a shift in tone on the
Yeah.
prior sentence. It sounds less certain.
Mm-hmm.
I realize you address that later in your speech, but it seems normal.
It is, yes. So sometimes we use academese because we're trying to hedge. I think there are better ways to hedge. So instead of it does appear, which is a very it's more cautious, I think you noted correctly. Perhaps in here I could say biological cues appear to influence racial categorizations more or something. I can still fix it. I have made this much more bold, you're right. But I could fix it in a way that still gets around the problem of it appears that being how I start this. Yeah.
Alternatively, that sort of a nonsensical it is always a good thing to avoid.
Yes.
Like the it at the beginning doesn't mean anything. So by saying there appears to be, just means nothing at all.
Right.
So I think that might be another way to interpret that is get rid of the generic it or there and replace it with a word that has a meaning.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you don't want anything as vague as that when you're trying to make all of your words count, for sure. All right, let's try another. Perceived autonomy is cultivated by conditions that provide informative rationales for engaging in a given behavior. The subject is this is, I think, the biggest roadblock to fixing academies, is we don't sometimes have subjects. So it's probably people, right? For whom is perceived autonomy being cultivated? People. So people feel more autonomous when they can rationalize their behavior, is a really flippant way of rewording it. That if you wanted to be really concise, you wanted to be punchy, you're getting the same information, but now we know who. Just people. Perhaps this is really vague and you want to be more specific than just people. Maybe this is only true of college students, so you'd want to put that there. We write this way sometimes when the subject, we don't really know who we're talking in generalizations, we don't know exactly who it is that we're describing an effect for. And when that's why we've done this, we should probably not do that. We got to be precise. One more here. Training individuals to benefit from the restorative function of nostalgia is valuable clinically. Another one where we don't have a subject. This one, though, I can't even tell you what the subject would be. It's not just people, because it's whoever's doing this training. So it's probably like clinicians or something, but it's really unclear. And so this kind of writing is not as optimal for readership. So the subject can be missing because of sloppy writing, or because the intent is to make a general statement. It doesn't matter who does it. Maybe it doesn't matter who trains people to use nostalgia. Maybe I don't want to get into it. Maybe an error was made and I don't want to tell you that one of my RAs made the error. So I'm just going to say an error was made. Sometimes it's covert. We want to hide who's responsible. It's sometimes fine. The solutions would be to add characters if you can. Use the passive voice when it doesn't matter, but be aware that you're doing that. Like, don't do that all of the time as your only solution to this problem. Just know, in this moment, I don't need a subject, so I'm using passive voice, but I'm going to need to be more active other ways to make up for it. And sometimes nominalizations do have a place. So sometimes we do need to use them. I try and cut them out always. But sometimes as a shorthand, before to a previous sentence, it's nice. If you find you have one of those sprawling sentences, you're like, I have to put a period in here somewhere. I don't want to have to give you a whole new subject in the next sentence. I'm just going to refer you back with these arguments. You just learned the arguments. Not great, but you can do it. Sometimes there's just things in your field that are nominalizations. Social rejection. Rejection is a really cool verb if you can use it that way. Like, oh, she was rejected is cooler than she experienced rejection, right? So you want the active version of it rather than the passive, but social rejection is just like an area within our field. If you're unfamiliar with social psych, we just study social rejection, not just, we do other things. But it would be weird if I stopped using that, or multisensory integration. If I just decided I'm no longer using that term, well, that's what the field is called, so you've made a mistake. You need to use it sometimes. But then, correctly, it was pointed out that some of this changes how much we hedge or intensify. There is strong evidence that the more junior we are, the less consciously we use our hedges and intensification. This is true in writing of STEM graduate students. I don't know about the humanities. I assume something similar is true because I think the mechanism here is something where it's like, I don't trust myself yet. There are more senior people around. I don't want to sound too like confident, and so we hedge a lot more when we're junior. But we also accidentally intensify a lot more when we're junior because we don't exactly have it honed yet to figure out how we're supposed to sound in our writing. So we're trying to sound confident, and we end up intensifying, and we're trying to like not step on toes, so we hedge too much. And so I don't have a solution for this because I don't know how much hedging and intensifying is relevant for whatever point you're trying to make, except to be aware of it when you're writing. Know whether you are hedging or whether you're accurately representing the state of things. So if you write, results of such studies typically show, that's just what comes out of the head, right? I'm like, oh, they typically show this. If you've gone through the literature extensively and you've never found an exception to what you've said, perhaps it's appropriate to say the results always show this. That's super bold. Always is a tough word to use. But it might be more than typically. You might say, like, with no exception that we found, they do this, instead of using that hedge typically. These results are essential for the study of blah, blah, blah. Perhaps I've just gotten disillusioned, but I rarely find that anything I find is essential for the study of something. It's usually helpful or important or something. Maybe I do have something that's essential, but I think it's important to know that those words are conveying a lot of information to your reader and use them carefully. Usually, in scientific writing, the field I know better, the most common and strong intensifier you can use is not hedging. So normally we say, while more research is needed, it looks like this might happen. If you just said, this happens, that would be like the strongest intensifier you could use. So be aware of your hedges, and if you can take some of them out, maybe think about it. So in summary, my advice for you is to write as much as you can. Have writing time where you let yourself play with ideas and construct something where it's not, I'm writing because I need to make a product. You could write to have an idea. You could write to work with some ideas you're kind of mulling around in your head. You can write to plan what you're going to write next. When writing to a particular goal, such as a paper or a grant proposal or conference submission, be structured and thoughtful. Plan what you're going to write, then write it, and then do a couple rounds of editing maybe until you're sure you have a good product at the end. And don't try and mix and match those stages together. So that's all the structured part of my presentation here. I'm happy to answer questions or field comments or anything if anyone has anything.